I was 17 this summer. I went to Camp Echo Pines. It wasn't anything fancy, just a rundown YMCA camp near the edge of a lake in New Hampshire. Mostly pine trees and mosquitoes. My mom found it through a church bulletin and thought it'd be a good character-building experience before senior year. It was the kind of place where the cabins had no locks. The showers were just a concrete room with a hose overhead, and breakfast was always cold eggs. I only stayed 1 week. I didn't know anyone there, and the other kids mostly kept to their friend groups. My cabin, Cabin 6, was way in the back, near the treen, farther from the main lodge than any of the others. It was smaller too, only 4 bunks. There were supposed to be 2 other guys in there with me, but one bailed last minute, and the other got sent home on the second night, with a stomach bug. After that I had the place to myself. The counselors didn't care much. They did roll call at meals and a head count at lights out, but no one double-checked where you slept, especially if you were quiet and didn't cause problems. I didn't mind the empty cabin. It was quiet and I liked having the space. The days were nothing special, canoeing, hiking, singing songs around the fire at night. But I remember starting to feel weird midweek around Wednesday or Thursday. It was subtle, just little things. One morning, I woke up and my flashlight, which I always kept under my pillow, was on the floor across the room. Another time, my duffel bag was unzipped when I was sure I had closed it. Nothing was missing, but my socks were all out of order, like someone had rummaged through them and shoved them back in. I figured maybe I was just tired. The cabins weren't exactly soundproof, and I hear noises at night, branch cracking, raccoons maybe, or other kids sneaking out. One night I swore I heard someone walking just outside, crunching slowly through the needles. But when I sat up and listened, it stopped. On Friday, the second to last night, something really strange happened. I was up late reading by flashlight. It was maybe 11:30. Everyone else had gone to bed. I heard the wooden steps creak, not like an animal but slow and deliberate, 1 step at a time. Then nothing. No knock, no voice. I waited, holding my breath, staring at the door, thinking maybe it was one of the counselors checking on me. But no one opened it. I got up and peeked out through the slit in the curtains. Just trees and shadows. The steps were empty. I left the flashlight on all night. The last night, Saturday, there was a big campfire and marshmallow roast. Everyone stayed up late. But I wasn't feeling great. Probably just worn out. So I left early. When I got back to the cabin, the woods were dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, just a kind of heavy silence. I remember noticing how dark it felt that night. The moon was out, but the trees were so thick around Cabin 6 that barely any light got through. I locked the door with the sliding bolt from the inside. Not that it mattered since the walls were just thin with slats and screens. I lay in my bunk facing the wall, trying to fall asleep. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to this weird feeling. Light. I wasn't alone. Not noise, not movement, just that feeling. I stayed still and listened. There was nothing, but I had this strong sense that someone was inside the cabin. I rolled over slowly. The room was empty. I could see the outlines of the bunks and the little shelf by the window. No one there. I told myself I was being dumb, that it was just my brain messing with me because it was the last night and I'd been sleeping alone all week. I turned over again and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and got on the bus like everyone else. I forgot about the weird stuff pretty quick. Life moved on. High school ended. College, jobs, whatever. Last month I was cleaning out some old boxes in my mom's garage. She's downsizing and a lot of my stuff from high school got tossed in together. One of the boxes was full of junk from that summer camp brochures. A broken flashlight, and this small stack of Polaroids wrapped in a rubber band. I flipped through them without thinking much. Most were just blurry shots of the lake or pictures of kids I didn't. But then I got to one that stopped me cold. It was a photo of me, dead in my bunk at Camp Echo Pines. I was lying on my side facing the wall, sleeping. The ankle was what got me. It wasn't taken from the doorway or the window. It was taken from inside the cabin, low to the ground, like someone had been crouching next to my bed. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was that it had to be a joke, maybe one of the other kids messing with me. But I'd been alone in that cabin almost the entire week, and the door had been bolted from the inside. I checked the back of the photo. Someone had written sad in faded pen. Saturday, the last night. I showed it to my mom. She barely looked at it and said something like, "Huh, weird," before going back to her paperwork. But I kept thinking about it. I tried to remember exactly how the camp was laid out. The window in cabin 6 didn't open. It was one of those old screens nailed into place. The only way in or out was the front door, and I know I locked it that night. I even went online and found a forum where people talked about old camps. Someone had uploaded a scanned copy of a map from Echo Pines dated the same year I went. I stared at it for hours, tracing the trail from the fire pit to cabin 6, remembering the way the porch steps creaked, how the trees blocked the moonlight. I don't know how someone got in or why they took that photo or how it ended up in my stuff. But I've been thinking about it a lot since then. About how quiet that night was. About the slow creak of the steps. The sense that someone was inside. I started wondering how many nights they were there just watching. If they ever touched anything. If they were just waiting. And if they ever took more than just a photo. I worked as a camp counselor at a place called Lake Arrow Summer Camp. It was one of those mid-tier camps out in rural Pennsylvania. Not too big, mostly kids from the suburbs whose parents wanted them off screens for a few weeks. I was 21 going into my senior year of college, and figured it'd be easy money, and a decent break from city life. The setup was typical cabins for the kids, a rec hall, a dining lodge, a small dock for kaying, and a separate staff cabin tucked back behind the main trail. Counselors didn't have private rooms or anything. We bunked near the kids, rotated nights off, and ate the same food they did. The kitchen staff had their own setup behind the dining hall, and we didn't deal with them much unless there was a problem with allergies or missing snacks. It was the second week of July when I started noticing something off. One morning, we were walking the kids back from archery, when one of the girls in my group, probably 10 years old, tripped and scraped her leg. It wasn't bad, just a little blood, but I walked her to the nurse's cabin anyway. When we got there, she looked up at me and said that lunch guy took my picture. I asked her what she meant. She said she saw him pointing his phone at her earlier during breakfast, when she was sitting with her friends. She thought maybe he was just taking a photo of the food, but she wasn't sure. She thought maybe he was just taking a photo of the food, but she wasn't sure. Didn't know his name. Just said he was the guy with the long ponytail, who always wore the same gray hoodie. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe he was texting or taking a picture of something else. But later that day during my break, I walked behind the dining hall to grab a soda from the vending machine, and I saw him standing there. Same gray hoodie, stringy hair pulled back, smoking by the dumpster. I didn't want to make a scene, so I just said casual like, "Hey, you working breakfast again tomorrow?" He looked up at me like he hadn't realized anyone else was there. His eyes kind of darted behind me first, like he was checking if I was alone. Then he said, "Yeah, same as always." His tone was weird, too flat, like he was waiting to see where I was going with it. That night, I mentioned it to Carly, another counselor who'd been there the summer before. I didn't say the kid's name or anything, just that someone had told me they thought one of the kitchen guys was taking pictures. She got quiet real fast. Then she said, "Was it the guy with the ponytail?" I nodded. She didn't say anything for a second, then told me to drop it. Said she'd heard a few things the year before, but the camp director didn't like people stirring stuff up. Apparently, someone had tried to report the same guy for something similar the previous summer, and they were basically told to let it go or lose their job. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't trying to be a hero or anything, but I wasn't about to let some creep take pictures of 10-year-olds. So, the next morning, I got up early and went to breakfast duty early, hoping to keep an eye out. I spotted him right away, standing near the kitchen doorway, hoodie on, phone in hand, not even pretending to be doing anything. He had the screen angled low, but not low enough. I watched him hold it up slightly and tap the screen just once right as one of the younger boys walked past, carrying a tray. I walked straight over to the counselor, a guy named Jared, and told him what I saw. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept, and kind of rubbed his eyes while I talked. When I finished, he said, "Okay, I'll talk to Director Holston." I asked if I should write anything down, and he just shook his head and said, "I'll handle it." Nothing happened. The guy was still there the next day, still working breakfast, still with that same hoodie. So, I went to Holston myself. His office was in a little trailer behind the admin building. I stepped inside and laid it out for him. Everything the girl said, while I saw the fact that I wasn't the first to notice. He listened, or at least he looked like he was listening. Then he leaned back in his chair, sighed and said, "I understand your concern, but unless you have a photo of him doing it, or a witness willing to put it in writing, there's not much we can act on." I told him I'd seen it with my own eyes. He said, "I'm not calling you a liar, but it's your word against his, and I don't want to ruin a man's life over a misunderstanding." Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'd suggest you forget about it. Focus on your group. You've got 3 more weeks here. Don't get caught up in things that don't concern you." That was the end of the conversation. I left feeling sick, like I just stepped into something I wasn't supposed to. I started noticing the guy more after that. Not just at meals, but outside the lodge, standing by the lake, always near the groups of younger kids, never interacting, just kind of there. One night, after lights out, I took a walk to clear my head. I followed the path that looped behind the cabins, past the fire pit toward the woods. I wasn't carrying a flashlight, didn't want to wake the kids, so it was just moonlight and the crunch of gravel under my shoes. About 10 minutes in, I got this weird sense that someone was behind me. I stopped and listened. Nothing at first, just leaves. Then maybe 20 feet back, I heard a small branch snap. I turned and stared down the path. There was someone there, just standing half in shadow. They weren't moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I walked fast back to the cabin, trying not to run, even though my chest felt tight and my ears were ringing. When I got back, I locked the door even though we weren't supposed to. I sat on the edge of my bunk and just listened. The next day I skipped breakfast and sat out front of the dining hall, pretending to organize a stack of schedules. I watched the guy come out the back door around 8:15, hoodie on, holding a to-go cup. He walked around the corner of the building, looked right at me, and smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was like he was letting me know he knew I was watching him. That afternoon, I made a call the nurse's landline during my break. Told my older brother, who's a cop in Delaware County, everything. I didn't ask him to intervene, just wanted someone to know in case something happened. He told me to get out of there. I told Holston the next day I had a family emergency and needed to leave. He looked annoyed, but he signed the papers and gave me my last check. I packed before sunrise. No one else was awake when I left except the kitchen guy. He was standing by the road near the back of the lodge. No smoke, no coffee, just standing there like he was waiting. I didn't say anything, just kept walking to the parking lot. As I got in my car, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still watching me, not moving, not smiling, just watching. The camp was up in the Catskills, way off any main road. You had to drive down this winding gravel path for like 15 minutes before you even saw the first cabin. I was working there the summer after sophomore year, mostly just for the free room and board. It wasn't a big camp. Maybe 40 kids total, and the counselors were all around my age, just college kids trying to kill time between semesters. I was assigned to cabin, one of the older ones near the tree line. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the screens had holes in them. The kids were all between 8 and 10. Nice enough group, mostly quiet once the lights went out. The first week was normal, just the usual homesickness, bug bites and kids sneaking candy. Lights out was at 9 and I'd usually hang out on the porch for a bit after they were asleep. Just sit on the steps with my little flashlight, check my phone if I had signal, listen to the crickets. It was probably the 6th night when I first heard the whistling. I was already in bed reading by flashlight under the covers. It was this steady, low whistle, not a tune I recognized, just 3 notes, kind of slow and spaced out. It sounded like it was coming from behind the cabin in the woods. At first I thought maybe it was one of the kids from the older boys' cabins playing a prank, but it kept going for almost a full minute. Then it stopped, just cut off mid-whistle. I waited for something else. Footsteps, laughing, a door creaking open, but it went totally quiet again. After a while, I figured whoever it was had gone back to their cabin, so I turned off my light and tried to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, I brought it up casually to the other counselors. Just asked if anyone else heard whistling last night. They all just looked at me. One guy, Nate, laughed and said, "What? Like ghost whistling?" A couple of them joked around, but nobody else had heard it, even the counselors in the cabins closest to mine. I figured maybe it had just sounded closer than it was. That night, nothing happened. Same the next. Then on the 3rd night after that, the whistling came back. It was a little after midnight. I know because I just checked the time on my phone before plugging it into the charger. Same 3-note pattern, same weird timing, but this time it was louder, closer, like whoever it was had moved around the side of the cabin. I got up and went to the window, pulled the curtain just a bit, and stared out. Nothing, just trees and moonlight. The sounds stopped again, just like before. No footsteps, no talking, just that weird hush that only happens in the middle of the night, in the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak in the cabin had me sitting up. Next day, the kids were acting kind of off. Not scared exactly, just sort of distracted and tired. At lunch, one of them, a little kid named Theo, asked if there were any weird animals that could crouch like people. I asked what he meant, and he just shrugged and said he thought he saw someone squatting in the woods the night before. Said they were all hunched and weird. I asked if it might have been one of the other kids, but he shook his head real fast and said, "No, they weren't wearing camp stuff." When I asked what they were wearing, he said, "Just dark clothes." Then he got quiet and didn't want to talk about it anymore. I went to the camp director that afternoon and told him what I've been hearing. He looked bored the whole time I was talking, just nodded a lot and said it was probably one of the teens from town messing around. Then he said, I shouldn't bring it up with the kids, because I might freak them out. That night I stayed up on purpose, sat on the steps of the cabin with my flashlight on my lap, and a hoodie over my head. Nothing happened for the first hour, then around 1:30 the whistling started again. But this time it came from the left side of the cabin near the fire pit that no one used after dark. I didn't move. I just turned off my flashlight and listened. It was the same pattern. Notes, pause, repeat. But now there was this soft, crunching sound, mixed in like someone shifting their weight in the leaves. Not walking exactly, just adjusting their position. I stayed completely still. The sound kept going for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped again. I waited another 10 minutes, then quietly got up and went inside. I locked the cabin door, even though we weren't technically supposed to. Climbed into bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. At breakfast, one of the kids, this super quiet girl named Maddie, came up to me and said, "I think there's someone in the trees." I asked her what she meant, and she said she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a person standing still, but really low, like squatting near the back of the cabin. I asked if she was sure it wasn't a dream, and she looked annoyed, like I'd insulted her. I was awake. I looked out the window. That's when I started to get scared for real. This wasn't some prank. Someone was out there watching the cabin. I went back to the director and pushed harder. Told him I thought someone was sneaking onto the property at night. He gave me this weird look and said, "We've never had a break-in here in over 20 years. Then he told me to stop scaring the kids and maybe take a night off if I was feeling sleep-deprived. So that night I didn't say anything to the kids. I didn't want them to panic. I just told them we'd keep the windows shut, because it might rain. After they were asleep, I sat near the window with a metal flashlight in my lap and the lights off. At around 2:00 a.m., the lights off. At around 2:00 a.m., the whistling started again, this time even closer. It was coming from directly behind the cabin. I got up as quietly as I could and moved to the back window. There was a small gap in the curtain, and through it I could just barely make out a shape crouched low between two trees. They weren't moving, not swaying, not breathing hard, just completely still watching. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My mouth went dry and my arms were covered in goosebumps. I stood there for probably a full minute, frozen. Then the person stood up. Not fast, not like they were trying to run, just slowly rising to full height. No flashlight, no visible face, just this tall outline of a man in dark clothes. He didn't come closer, didn't run, he just turned and walked back into the trees. I stayed up until sunrise. In the morning I told the director again. Told him there was someone outside my cabin, someone real. He just stared at me and said, "We've already got 2 people quitting this week. Don't make it 3. So, I packed my things, called my brother to come pick me up, and told the camp I had a family emergency. Right before I left, one of the kids, Theo, came up and gave me a drawing. It was just crayon on construction paper, but it made my stomach twist. It was our cabin surrounded by trees, with a black stick figure crouching just outside the window. No face, just a circle with 2 dots watching. It was the summer before my junior year, and I was working as a counselor at a small sleep-away camp in Vermont. Nothing fancy, just a bunch of wooden cabins, a lake, some trails, and a dining hall that always smelled like peanut butter and mop water. I was in charge of cabin 4, which had 6 girls between the ages of 9 and it was my first time doing something like this, and honestly, I didn't care much about the camp experience. I just wanted a paycheck and free food. The job was mostly fine. The kids were loud and occasionally annoying. Sweet. Days were packed with swimming, crafts, and hikes. Nights were quiet except for the usual cabin whispers and someone always needing to pee at 2:00 a.m. There was one girl in my group, named Katie, 9 years old. Super quiet, one of those kids who always looked like she was thinking really hard about something but never said it out loud. She wasn't shy exactly, just kind of out of sync with the rest of the group. She kept to herself and drew a lot, mostly little animals with big eyes. names written underneath in crayon. The third week of camp is when things got weird. It was a Tuesday, hot and sticky, and our group was scheduled for nature exploration, which basically meant wandering around the woods behind the lake for an hour with magnifying glasses, pretending we were teaching them something. We did this almost every other day, and they always stayed together pretty well, except that day Katie didn't come back. I didn't even notice at first. The kids were noisy, cracking sticks and yelling about bugs, and I was focused on keeping them away from a hornet nest someone had just found. It wasn't until we were walking back toward camp that I did a head count and came up short. I counted again, still one short. I asked the girls who had seen Katie last. One of them said she'd been looking at a big rock a few minutes earlier, but that was it. I told the other counselor, then started jogging back toward the spot. It was just woods dense enough to feel isolated, but not wild or anything. No cliffs or water nearby. I looked around, calling her name. Nothing. I kept walking deeper, heart thudding a little harder each minute. After 10 minutes, I got a sick feeling in my chest and radioed it in. They sent out staff to search. It turned into this whole scramble. Half the counselors and even the kitchen staff fanned out through the woods. The director was trying not to act panicked, but it was obvious he was everyone. Everyone kept saying she must have just wandered off and was probably hiding or lost. It took over 2 hours to find her. Came walking out of the woods, near the maintenance shed, which was way off from where she'd last been seen. She wasn't crying or scratched up or anything, just pale and quiet. The camp nurse checked her out and said she was fine, just a little dehydrated. They asked her where she'd been, and she said in this calm voice, "A man asked me to help him find his dog." She said he'd been walking through the woods with a leash in his hand, and told her his dog had run off. She said he asked, really politely, and she followed him, because she didn't want the dog to be scared. When they asked what happened next, she said she followed him for a little while. She wasn't sure how long, and then told him she had to pee. She said he pointed behind a tree and said she could go there. She said when she didn't come back right away, he called out but then stopped and left. She said she waited behind the tree until she didn't hear anything, then walked in the opposite direction until she saw the camp buildings. The director asked her what the man looked like, and she just shrugged and said, "Normal." That was the word she used, normal. They didn't tell the other campers what she said. They just told everyone she got turned around in the woods. But the rest of us, especially the counselors, we heard the real version and no one believed it. They said she probably made it up because she was embarrassed about getting lost, or that she imagined it. One of the senior staff even joked she was too into her own little fantasy world. I didn't say much at the time, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Katie didn't act embarrassed. She wasn't even flustered. It was like she just told them what she had for breakfast. That night I stayed up a little later than usual. The girls had gone to bed, and I was sitting on the edge of the porch in the dark, drinking warm water from my bottle and listening to the frogs. I remember looking out at the tree and thinking about how easy it would be to step into those woods and disappear. How even with a search party you could go in the wrong direction and no one would know. I started wondering about this man. Was he real? Had he just walked right onto the camp property? A few days passed. Everything went back to normal on the surface. Katie was even quieter than before. She stopped drawing animals and started making these strange little scribbles on the edges of her paper, like barked wire or tangled roots. Then one morning, I noticed her sneakers were muddy, not like camp dirty, like she'd gone somewhere wet, but it hadn't rained, and we hadn't gone near the lake that day. I asked her about it. She said she woke up thirsty and went to the dining hall to get water. That made no sense. The dining hall was a 10-minute walk, and it would have been locked, but she said it like it was totally normal. then went back to our cereal. That night I stayed awake again. I set my alarm for 2 a.m. and sat by the window facing the woods. Nothing happened for a long time, just crickets and the occasional rustle in the trees. Then, around 3:15, I saw movement. It was small, just a shadow shifting between the trees. I leaned closer to the screen, heart thudding. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I could make out the outline of a figure walking slowly along the edge of the woods, not coming closer, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't want to wake the girls. I just sat there frozen, until the figure turned and walked back into the woods. The next morning I went straight to the director, told him what I saw. He gave me the same tired look and said, "You probably saw one of the kitchen staff going for a smoke." I told him it wasn't near the kitchen. He shrugged and said, "Maybe someone was lost." I realized then that no one was going to do anything. I started sleeping with a flashlight in my sleeping bag and a Swiss Army knife in my hoodie pocket. I didn't say anything to the kids. What could I say? That some man might be sneaking through the woods at night, asking kids to help him look for fake dogs. The last night of camp, Katie gave me a folded piece of paper before lights out. She didn't say anything, just handed it to me and got into bed. I waited until they were all asleep before I opened it. It was another drawing, but not like the others. This one showed a girl standing next to a tall man. The man was holding a leash, but there was no dog. Behind him were trees, and behind the trees were eyes, just little white circles drawn in pen. In the corner, in small, careful letters she'd written. He said I was too smart to keep. I still think about that, about what would have happened if she hadn't said she had to pee, about how close the woods were, about how no one believed her or me. But I did believe her. I still do. It was my second year working at Camp Silver Birch, a pretty low-key summer camp in upstate New York. Just cabins, a lake, the usual stuff. I had a group of 7 boys that year, all between 12. Some of them were a hyper, won't stop talking type, and a couple were quieter, mostly into carts or whittling sticks. Our cabin sat at the edge of camp, kind of tucked near the woods. It was the last one before the tree line. There was a dirt trail behind us that led out to the old archery range that didn't get used anymore, and beyond that just forest for miles. Nights were usually calm. I'd do the final head count, make sure flashlights were within reach, windows closed, bug spray out. Then I'd get in my bunk, near the door, and try to get a few hours before one of the kids needed to pee, or woke up scared of an owl or something. This one night, midway through the second week, was hot. Mucky in that way, where the sheets stick to your legs and everything feels damp. I remember because I'd kept the screen door cracked with just the latch on, hoping for a breeze. That ended up being a mistake. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. Not to a sound exactly, but something else. A feeling like someone had been moving nearby. Like the kind of half-wake you get when someone walks past your bed. At first I didn't sit up. I just opened my eyes and looked across the cabin. Moonlight was coming in through the windows, so I could make out the shapes of the bunk beds, the sleeping bags, the hanging towels. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed the front door was wide open. Not the screen door, the main door. It was just swam all the way open, not blowing in the wind, just standing there perfectly still. I sat up slowly. Every single kid was still in bed. Nobody was missing. No one standing by the doorway. But then I looked at the floor and saw it. Muddy footprints, not shoe prints, bare feet. They started from the open door, went across the cabin and stopped right at Kyle's bed. Kyle was one of the youngest in the group. He slept like a rock, mouth wide open, arms tossed above his head like he was making snow angels. The footprints were small, I remember that. Not adult-sized, but not quite like a little kid either. Maybe like a teen's. I don't know. I just remember the way they looked. Too exact, too clear. Like the feet had been wet, like someone had just walked in a few minutes ago. I got up, heart pounding, and quietly shut the door. Locked it. Then I turned on my flashlight and checked under every bed in the little bathroom behind the shelves. Nothing. The woods outside were dead quiet. Not even crickets. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just sat by the door with my flashlight on and a broomstick in my lap listening. The next morning, I didn't tell the kids anything. I cleaned up the footprints before they woke up and just said I couldn't sleep because of the heat. I brought it up to one of the other counselors at breakfast, though. He said it was probably just one of the kids sleepwalking and stepping in mud. But the thing is, none of them had muddy feet. I checked. First thing I did when they were all up and getting dressed that day. I stuck closer to the group than usual. Kept a sharp eye out. We did swim time, crafts, the usual schedule. Nothing weird happened. By lunch I started to wonder if maybe it had been one of the kids, or even me. Half dreaming. That night I locked the door tight and wedged a chair under the handle. Felt dumb doing it, but whatever, I just didn't want a repeat of the night before. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time it was a sound. A creak like someone stepping on the front porch. I didn't move, just listened. There was another creak, then a faint, deliberate knock. Not loud, not urgent. Just 3 soft taps, like someone didn't want to wake the whole cabin. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. I didn't turn it on, just held it there, frozen. There was no voice, no movement, no more knocking. I waited maybe 10 minutes before I stood up, walked slowly to the door, and whispered, "Who's there?" Nothing. I didn't open it. I waited another minute, then finally flicked on the flashlight and pulled the curtain back, just a little. No one was there. But on the ground, on the wooden steps were more muddy prints, a little more smeared this time, like whoever it was had been pacing, were shifting their weight while standing. I felt sick, like actual nausea in my throat. I shut the curtain, turned the flashlight off, and just stood there for a long time. That morning I went straight to the camp director, told him everything. The footprints, the open door, the knocking. He nodded like he was listening, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. "We've got raccoons," he said. "Sometimes they push doors open looking for snacks." I told him, "Raccoons don't knock." He laughed. Literally laughed. He sent the maintenance guy to check the latch on our door, and that was it. I started sleeping in my clothes after that, just in case. Kept a pocket knife under my pillow, which I wasn't even supposed to have. 3 nights later, it happened again, but this time, I didn't wake up from noise. I woke up because of the cold. It was cold in the cabin, like weirdly cold for July. I sat up and saw that the door was open again, just like before, wide open, and this time, the footprints weren't going toward Kyle's bed. They were going toward mine. I stared at them for a long time, trying not to breathe too loud. They were fresh, still wet. I reached slowly under my pillow, grabbed a knife and clicked on the flashlight. Then I shouted, "Who's there?" One of the boys gasped awake, sat up in panic, but the rest just stirred. I ran to the door and stepped onto the porch, swung the light around. Nothing, just woods. But the weirdest part, there were no prints leading away, just to the door into the cabin, not a single one going back out. I kept everyone inside the next day, made up some excuse about poison ivy being spotted near the trails. I didn't let them leave my sight for more than a minute. That afternoon, I took my flashlight and followed the old path behind our cabin, the one that led toward the abandoned archery range. I don't really know why. I just needed to look. Needed to know if someone had been out there. The path was overgrown, barely even a trail anymore. I walked about 10 minutes before I saw it. An old camp tent, the kind we use during overnight hikes, dirty, slouched over, half covered in branches, hidden. I stood still for a long time. Then I slowly walked over and pulled the flap open. Inside there was a sleeping bag, empty snack wrappers, a flashlight, a pair of muddy bare footprints dried into the tent floor. That was the last night I stayed at that camp. I told the director I had a family emergency and left 2 days before the end of the session. I didn't explain. I didn't say goodbye. I never found out who it was. Someone, a local, someone who used to work there, and just stayed. I don't know. All I know is that someone was walking into our cabin at night, watching us sleep, standing at the foot of those beds, barefoot and silent. And if I had started locking the door and wedging it shut, I don't think they would have stopped at just standing there. I worked at a summer camp in Vermont for 3 years in a row. Small place, nothing fancy, just a cluster of old cabins, a lake, and some hiking trails that twisted through the woods behind the property. The camp was called Hollow Pines. Most of the counselors came back each summer, so by my 3rd year, I knew everyone pretty well. Same schedule, same pranks, same counselor campfire stories we told to scare the new kids. That year, I had cabin-side 12 to 13-year-old boys. Some of them were returning campers. Some were new. The second day of the session, this one kid showed up late. His name was Evan. His mom dropped him off after dinner, said he'd missed the bus, and she had to drive up from Massachusetts. I didn't think much of it. He was skinny, pale, didn't say much. Wore a Red Sox cap and had a beat-up old duffel bag that looked like it had been packed in a rush. Right away, I noticed something weird about him. Not anything huge, just he stared a lot. Not at the other kids, at me. During orientation stuff, while I was talking about fire safety or the camp schedule, I'd glance around and catch him looking right at me. Not with curiosity, not like he was confused, just flat out staring, eyes locked, like I was the only person in the room. I figured maybe he was just shy or had some social thing going on, so I didn't say anything. Kids are kids, but he kept doing it during meals at the lake, even when we were doing archery. He never joined in much, just sat nearby and watched me. By the 3rd day, it was getting under my skin. I tried to be friendly, asked if he needed anything, if he was settling in. Okay, if he wanted to join a group. He always just nodded or mumbled "I'm fine" without looking away. Then one night, after lights out, I was walking back from the counselor meeting, maybe around 11:30. The woods were dead quiet. I got to my cabin, opened the door, and there he was, Evan, sitting up in bed, just sitting there, the dark, arms around his knees, watching the door like he'd been waiting for me to come in. I flicked the flashlight on, half joking. "You trying to give me a heart attack, man?" He didn't laugh, didn't say anything, just laid back down without a word. I started sleeping with a flashlight next to my pillow. After that, the really weird part happened about 5 days into camp. We were doing tie-dye t-shirts at one of the picnic tables, and one of the younger counselors, Morgan, came by to say the mess hall needed help moving coolers. I asked Evan if he'd be okay finishing his shirt on his own. He said, "Yeah." I walked off with Morgan. Took maybe 10 minutes. When I got back, Evan was gone. I checked the bathrooms, the nearby trail, even peeked inside our cabin. Nothing. The other kids hadn't seen him leave. Eventually, I found him behind the arts and crafts shed, standing completely still with his back to the wall, just staring at the trees. I asked what he was doing. He said I was waiting for what? For you. I didn't know what to say. I told him we were heading back for dinner and kind of rushed him along. That night, I brought it up to the camp director. She asked if he'd been aggressive or inappropriate, and when I said no, just quiet and kind of strange, she said to keep an eye on him, but that some kids just had trouble adjusting. That might have been the end of it. Honestly, I was creeped out, but not scared. Not yet. Then 2 nights later I was doing cabin checks. Each counselor had to do one final walk through around 1 a.m. before lights out was officially called. I just finished checking cabin B and was heading back when I passed the lake path. As I don't know why I looked, but I did. Someone was standing on the dock alone, barely visible in the moonlight. I thought maybe one of the kids had snuck out to swim, so I jogged over. But when I got closer, I saw it was Evan. He wasn't swimming. He wasn't even moving. He was just standing there at the edge of the dock, facing the water, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I called out his name. He didn't respond, just slowly turned his head and looked at me. That same stare. No surprise, no guilt, just like he'd been waiting again. I told him he couldn't be out here alone at night and started walking him back. About halfway there, he said something that made me stop cold. He said, "I knew you at Green Hollow. You used to go by Maddie." I hadn't used that nickname since I was 9, and I hadn't been to Green Hollow camp since I was a kid. That was in Pennsylvania. Whole different state, whole different life. I stopped walking. "What did you say?" He just looked at me and said it again. Clear this time. "At Green Hollow you were smaller. You had longer hair." I felt like all the air went out of my chest. There was no way he should have known that. I hadn't mentioned that camp to anyone here. Hell, I barely remembered it myself. I asked him how he knew that. He didn't answer. Just kept walking like we'd never spoken. I barely slept that night. I lay in my bunk watching the ceiling, trying to remember if I'd met him before. Maybe a sibling of someone I used to know. But Evan was too young. I was 15 now. He was maybe 12 at most. Back when I went to Green Hollow, he would have been a toddler. Next morning, I asked the director if she had Evan's registration form. Said I wanted to double-check some allergy info. She printed it for me. He was from Medford, Massachusetts. That part one already knew. But his birthday, he was born in 2012. I went to Green Hollow in 2010. I started keeping more distance after that. I'd still do my job, check in on all the kids, help with the games and crafts. But I didn't talk to Evan unless I had to. He still stared, still tracked my movements like he was memorizing something. The last night of camp, we did a big campfire. Songs. As counselors doing stupid skits. I kept catching him watching me from across the circle. I tried to ignore it. Figured I'd just get through the night, and that would be it. When we headed back to the cabins, I stayed up later than usual, packing my stuff so I could leave early in the morning. Around 2 a.m., I heard something, a creak on the porch outside. I froze. It was soft, like someone putting their weight slowly on a loose board. I turned off my lantern and just sat there listening. Another creak. Then a pause. Then a whisper right at the edge of the door. "Maddie." I didn't move. I didn't answer. The doorknob turned quiet, slow, but I'd locked it. Thank God I'd locked it. I grabbed a flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it at the door. Through the window I saw him. Evan standing there barefoot in his camp t-shirt and boxers, just staring at the knob. When he saw the light, he didn't run. He just backed away step by step until the darkness swallowed him up. I left before breakfast, told the director I had a family emergency, tossed my half-packed duffel in the trunk, and drove 6 hours back home in silence. I never found out how he knew who I was, or why he came to that camp. I didn't go back the next year. I didn't answer the follow-up emails. I don't even live in Vermont anymore. But sometimes I still think about the way he said my name. Not like he'd heard it in passing, not like he'd read it somewhere, like he'd known me, like he remembered me. It was my second summer working at Pine Hollow Camp. I was one of the older counselors the year, 19, mostly doing it for the free room and board, and a break from my parents. I had cabin 6 bunk beds, chipped paint on the walls, no AC, just a creaky old ceiling fan that clicked every few rotations and one working flashlight. We passed around like gold. The boys in my cabin were all around 11 or 12. Pretty normal group, some loud, some quiet, but nothing too weird. About a weekend, we'd settled into a decent routine. I'd do lights out around 9:30, then stay up in my bunk for another hour or two, reading or texting on the spotty Wi-Fi. One afternoon, I was doing my usual room check, making sure nobody left food out or shoved wet towels under their beds. I was lifting up one of the lower mattresses, just some kid's messy pile of comic books and socks, and saw a little blue spiral notebook wedged between the plywood and the bed frame. No name on the cover, just stickers peeling off the front. I figured it was just doodles or whatever, but when I opened it, the first page said, "If you're reading this, don't sleep on the bottom bunk." I laughed a little, thinking it was a joke. Probably one kid trying to mess with another. But I flipped to the next page anyway. The handwriting was small, kind of messy like a younger kid's. Each entry had a date, always around midnight, and short little sentences. Stuff like, "It touched my hair again last night, just a few times. No one else woke up. Woke up and smelled dirt like someone came in from outside. Tried to stay awake, but it waited. It always waits." It went on like that. Maybe 20 entries total. A couple were smudged like someone had cried on the page. At that point I started to feel weird. Not scared exactly, just uncomfortable. Like I'd walked into someone's room without knocking. I looked at the underside of the mattress again. It was the bunk Liam slept on. Real quiet kid, barely talked. Always had his hoodie on, even when it was hot. I'd never noticed anything off about him, but I hadn't really paid that close attention either. That night I asked the kids casually if they were all sleeping. Okay, just slipped it into conversation while they were brushing their teeth. Most said, yeah. One kid said the fan kept him up. Liam just shrugged and kept his eyes down. I didn't bring up the notebook. I probably should have turned it in or something. But I didn't. I just put it back where I found it. The next couple of nights, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started staying up later, pretending to be on my phone, but really just listening. Cabin 6 always got super quiet around 11 You could hear the woods outside, crickets, the occasional twig snap. I never heard anything weird, but I started noticing stuff, little things. The back screen door didn't latch quite right, even when it was locked. One of the windows near the bathroom had a broken lock that nobody had fixed. I hadn't thought much of it before. The cabins were old, everything creaked and shifted, but now I kept checking them, rechecking them. Then one night around 2 a.m., I was still awake in my top bunk watching the ceiling fan go around when I heard something. It was soft, like a shoe dragging lightly across the wood floor. I held my breath and waited, thinking maybe one of the boys had gotten up to pee. But no one moved. Then I heard it again. Just one slow step. I leaned over the edge of my bunk and looked down. I couldn't see much, just the tops of the beds and a sliver of the aisle. Everything looked still. I whispered, "Who's up?" Nothing. No response. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, shining it across the floor. All the bunks were full. All the kids were still in bed. Except Liam. His blanket was pulled up, but his bed was empty. I scanned the cabin, then saw him. He was standing near the back door, just standing there facing the door like he was waiting for something. I whispered his name. He didn't move. I got down from my bunk as quietly as I could and walked over. My stomach felt tight the whole time. I didn't even know why. When I got close, I asked, "You okay?" He nodded, still facing the door. His hand was on the knob. I asked what he was doing. He said, real quiet, "It's not coming in tonight." I didn't know what to say to that. I brought him back to his bunk and sat in the counselor chair at the end of the aisle for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. The whole cabin felt wrong. Still like the air was waiting for something to happen. Next morning I tried to talk to him again. He barely said 2 words. Just kept his head down and pulled his hood up like usual. That afternoon, I checked the notebook again. New entry. "He saw me last night. I don't think it like that. I don't think it'll stop now." I checked the whole cabin. Windows, doors, everything was closed. Nothing was broken, but when I looked under Liam's bed, there were 4 small streaks of mud on the floorboards. Like someone had stepped inside with wet shoes and wiped them clean. That night, I sat in the counselor chair again. I left the flashlight on my lap and kept one hand on the handle. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is hearing breathing. Not snoring, just breathing. Not close, but not far either. I opened my eyes and the flashlight was still in my lap. I hadn't moved, but someone else had. Liam's bed was empty again. I stood up and scanned the room, heart pounding, thinking maybe he went to the bathroom. I whispered his name. Nothing. I checked the bathroom. Empty. Then I looked at the back door. It was cracked open. I stepped outside and my flashlight beam caught him about 20 feet into the trees. He was barefoot, standing still in the dirt, just staring off into the woods. I called out. He didn't answer. I walked toward him and he finally turned his head. His face looked blank. Not scared, not sad, just tired. I asked what he was doing. He said it watches from there. I asked, "What does?" He looked at me and said, "The man who comes in." That was enough for me. I brought him back to the cabin and locked every window and door myself. I made the camp director come down in the morning and read the notebook. She didn't say much, but she moved Liam to the nurse's cabin for the rest of the week. I never found out if he made that whole thing up or if he was just scared of someone. Maybe one of the older kids had been messing with him, maybe worse. I honestly don't know, but the night after they moved him, I found the back door unlatched again. No footprints, nothing stolen, just unlocked. I left the camp 2 days early. Didn't even finish my last shift. I told them I had to deal with something back home. I never went back the year after. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and I took a job as a counselor at a camp in northern Michigan, Camp Everpine, mostly to get away from home and have a quiet few months. It wasn't fancy or anything, just cabins and canoes and mosquito nets with holes in them. I was in charge of a cabin of 8 boys, ages 9 to 11, hyper messy but harmless. There were probably 30 or 40 counselors total, plus a kitchen staff and maintenance crew. We all kinda stayed in our own lanes. The Crown's crew mostly kept to themselves, older guys, some local, some just seasonal hires. About 2 weeks in, one of my kids, his name was Tyler, started getting weird. At first I thought he was just homesick. He didn't want to swim, kept asking to call home, and flinched every time the lawnmower guys came near the cabin area. I figured he was nervous around loud engines or something, no big deal. But then one afternoon, we were walking back from archery, and he tugged my shirt and said, "That man used to be at my school." I looked where he was pointing. It was one of the Crown's crew guys. Maybe late 40s, kind of pale, skinny, had a limp. He wore a faded hat low over his eyes. I'd seen him a couple times raking by the woods line or hauling trash bags. I didn't know his name. "You sure?" I asked. Tyler nodded. He was there before he got in trouble. That stopped me for a second.
What kind of trouble? He just said he wasn't allowed near us anymore. I crouched a little and asked, did something happen? But he clammed up and shook his head. I didn't want to push him, and I wasn't really sure what to do with that info. It's not like I had a way to check if this guy had a record or anything, but I did tell one of the senior counselors, Maya. She was in her mid-20s and took the job way more seriously than the rest of us. She said she'd mention it to the camp director. The next day, the guy was gone. Not like fired with a big meeting or anything. Just wasn't there anymore. His tools were still in the shed, but he didn't show up for breakfast or any of the grounds crew's usual stuff. One of the other maintenance guys, an older man named Ron, said he probably moved on. That was the phrase he used. Moved on. I thought it was weird, but I figured maybe the camp just quietly let him go. Probably safer that way. That should have been the end of it. But the night after that, I was doing my usual bunk checks, making sure the kids had brushed their teeth. Lights were out, no one sneaking snacks, and I noticed something off. Tyler's stuff had been gone through. He had this little canvas duffel he kept under his bed, and when I passed by, it was sitting half unzipped. He always kept it zipped tight. Inside, his comic books were spread out like someone had flipped through them fast. His flashlight was missing. I asked if he'd been looking for something, but he said no. He hadn't touched it. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My bunk was right next to the screen window, and every few minutes, I kept thinking I heard crunching outside like someone walking on dry pine needles. I got up, pulled on a hoodie, and stepped outside. The woods were pitch black. I scanned the tree line with my phone flashlight. Nothing. Could have been a deer. We got raccoons around camp sometimes too. Next day I asked around about the grounds crew guy. No one seemed to know much. One of the kitchen girls said she never even got his name. Maya told me she asked the director about him, and he just said he didn't show up for shift. Probably just left. No follow-up. No contact info. Nothing. I thought about Tyler's comment again. Not allowed near us anymore. That night, I made sure to lock our cabin door. Most of the time, we didn't even bother. It was a screen door with a flimsy handle lock. But still, I wedged one of the benches under the handle just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound I still can't describe right. It was like what's straining, a slow bending, like when someone leans their full weight on a creaky floorboard. I sat up and listened. Then I heard a small thud at the far end of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and slid out of bed. The kids were all still asleep, or pretending to be. I walked quietly down the aisle between bunks and listened. Another creak. This one closer. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the back window. Nothing. But the window screen looked different. A little looser in the corner. I checked it up close and saw one of the screen staples had been pulled out like someone had tried to pry it loose and gave up. The next morning I found muddy smudges on the outside of the cabin just under the window. A couple partial footprints too. Someone barefoot. I went straight to the director. I told him everything. Tyler's comment. The missing guy. The noise. The screen. He nodded the whole time but didn't write anything down. Just said, "We'll have security do extra rounds." Probably just a drifter. That answer didn't sit right with me. Who drifts through the middle of a gated summer camp in the woods and messes with one cabin's window? That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up in a chair near the window with a flashlight in my lap and a heavy book in my hands. I didn't know what I planned to do with it. Just felt better having something to hold. Around 2:40 a.m. Breathing. Not mine. Not the kids. It was coming through the window screen. Very slow, shaky, like someone trying to stay quiet, but too close to control it. I didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard fingers brush the screen. Light taps like someone testing it. I stood up fast and flicked on the flashlight.
The beam hit the trees, but I caught a glimpse of something pulling back into the dark. A figure hunched, limping. I ran outside barefoot, heart pounding so loud it hurt my ears. There was no one there, just the trees swaying in the tail end of footsteps. Way too quiet for how fast they must have been moving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Didn't take my eyes off the window. When morning came, I told my everything. She didn't act surprised. She told me the camp had no record of hiring the guy. No full name, no ID copy, not even a tax form. Just showed up with the crew one day and started raking. The camp director retired 2 weeks later. No announcement. Just left a note and went home. I stayed for the rest of the summer, but I moved my kids to a different cabin. We kept the door locked every night and rotated watch shifts between the counselors after that. No one saw the man again. No one admitted to knowing him. But 2 nights before camp ended, Tyler came to my bunk and whispered. I heard him breathing again. We stayed awake till sunrise. Nothing happened. No footprints, no noise. But I never worked at another camp after that. It came in a plain envelope. No return address, no stamp, just showed up in my mailbox one Wednesday in July. The paper inside was folded once, clean edges. There was a photo, a printed photo, not digital, of an old wooden cabin with peeling green paint and a rusty horseshoe nailed over the door. Tucked behind it was a note. You left me behind. That was it, nothing else. It took me a second to even place the cabin. But the more I stared at it, the more I remembered. Camp Gray Birch. I hadn't thought about that place in years. I only went one summer when I was 13. I was one of those quiet, awkward kids who never really fit in anywhere. Camp was supposed to build character. My mom said what it built was a collection of weird memories I'd pushed out of my head. That photo, though, it brought everything back. Especially what happened with Daniel. He was in my cabin that summer. Cabin 4B. I still remember the smell, sweat, wet wood, and that weird old mattress plastic. There were 6 of us in the cabin, plus a counselor named Drew, who barely paid attention unless someone was bleeding, missing. Daniel was a little off from the beginning. Not in a scary way, just wrong somehow. He was really skinny, pale, and had these deep, dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He always wore long sleeves, even in the heat. He didn't talk much, just watched. He'd sit on the edge of his bed during free time and just stare out the screen window for hours. The rest of us thought he was weird, but harmless. We joked about him being a vampire or robot or whatever. Then stuff started disappearing. First it was snacks. Then a flashlight, then a pocket knife one of the other kids had brought even though we weren't supposed to. True didn't care, said we probably just misplaced our junk. Then someone's duffel bag got emptied under their bed. Clothes all cut up. The kid swore he didn't do it. Said he woke up and it was just like that. That same night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. Real soft. I looked around and at first I didn't see anything weird, but then I noticed Daniel sitting up on his bed whispering to something in his hands. I couldn't tell what it was. His back was to me. I laid back down and pretended to sleep, but I kept one eye cracked open. Eventually he got up and walked toward the door. It creaked when he opened it just a little. He looked back over his shoulder. I shut my eyes real fast. I heard the door close behind him. I waited maybe 5 minutes, then got up and peeped through the screen window. The moon was bright, and I could see him walking toward the woods with that thing in his hands. It looked like a doll, but not a store-bought one, like it was made from sticks and twine. I watched him until he disappeared into the trees. Next morning he was asleep in bed like nothing happened. I told Drew. He didn't believe me, said maybe I had a nightmare, or made it out because the other kids didn't like Daniel. A week later, a kid from another cabin went missing. His name was Corey. They found his shoes near the lake, but never found him. Some of the staff said he probably ran away. But 13-year-olds don't run away barefoot in the middle of the night, not through those woods. After that, camp got weird. Activities got canceled. We weren't allowed near the water without a buddy. The counselor stopped slacking off and started doing actual head counts. Daniel acted like none of it affected him. He still didn't talk, still stared out the window, still disappeared some nights. One morning I woke up and found that weird little doll thing tucked under my pillow. It smelled like dirt and something sour. I threw it in the trash outside and told Drew again. This time he actually listened. He pulled Daniel outside and asked him if he was the one leaving creepy little gifts for people. Daniel just looked at him and smiled. That's the only time I ever saw him smile. 2 days before camp ended, Daniel didn't show up for breakfast or canoeing, or lunch. They searched the whole property, even brought in dogs, never found him. The last night of camp, they put all of us in the main lodge to sleep, said it was precautionary, but we all knew. When the buses came the next morning, nobody really said goodbye. My mom picked me up and asked if I had fun. I said no. That was the end of it until now. Until that letter, I didn't know what to do with it. I kept telling myself it was a prank, some sick joke. Maybe one of the guys from back then remembered the story and decided to mess with me. But I hadn't talked to anyone from that summer in over a decade, didn't even have their last names anymore. The next day, I drove out to where the camp used to be. It shut down years ago, but I found the road. Weeds had taken over most of it, and the old wooden sign had collapsed into the ditch. I parked at the gate. It was chained, but the fence on the side had a hole big enough to crawl through. I walked for a while through knee-high grass and broken trails. Most of the buildings were rotted out. Some had caved in completely, but cabin 4B was still standing. Looked almost exactly like the photo. I didn't go inside. I just stood there staring at it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Nailed to the tree beside the cabin, low to the ground, was a small wooden figure, twine around the middle. Stick arm, same kind of doll, fresh. The wood wasn't weathered. The twine looked new. I backed away and walked fast. I didn't run. I didn't want to look scared. When I got back to my car, envelope was sitting on the windshield. Same handwriting. Inside was another note. You were supposed to come back for me. I called the police, showed them the letters, the photos, filed a report. They took it seriously, but nothing ever came of it. I changed my locks, got cameras installed, haven't received anything else since. But sometimes I still check the trees around my house just in case. When I was a kid, I went to Camp Pioneer every summer. It was one of those camps, nestled deep in the woods, where your phone didn't work, and the only way to tell time was by the sun. The usual stuff, canoeing, archery, campfires, hiking trails. I went every summer from age 10 to 14. One summer when I was 12, this new counselor showed up halfway through the session. His name was Mark. I don't remember anyone announcing him or introducing him properly. One day he was just there. Tall guy, scruffy beard, kind of looked like he didn't really want to be there. He never wore the camp t-shirt like the other counselors. Just old jeans and a hoodie, even on hot days. At first, nobody thought much of it. The counselors were always changing. Some would leave early, some would be late getting there. But Mark was different. He didn't really talk much. When he did, it was mostly 1 or 2 words, answering questions or telling kids to line up or whatever. He was quiet, but oddly intimidating, not in a mean way. More like he didn't want to be noticed, but also didn't want to be messed with. The weird thing was no one ever saw him do any real counselor stuff. He didn't lead activities, didn't teach anything, didn't hang out with us except at meals, and even then, he mostly sat by himself at the edge of the dining hall, staring out the window. The other counselors made jokes about him being some kind of woodsman or a drifter passing through. We thought maybe he was just a temp or a last-minute hire who wasn't really trained, but the camp director never said anything about it. Little things started to feel off. One night during a thunderstorm, some kids woke up and said they saw a shadow outside the cabins. At first the counselors joked about it, but I remember Mark was the only one who got up to check. He walked out into the rain with a flashlight, but he didn't say anything when he came back. Just sat down silently and stared at the fire like nothing happened. Another time, someone's bike went missing. It was chained up outside the rec hall, but the lock had been cut clean. The counselors questioned everyone. No one owned up to it. Mark didn't even look surprised. A couple of days later, the bike just showed up, leaning against the fence, mud splattered and missing the front wheel. The kids started whispering about him. We said he was creepy, but didn't really know why. He never smiled, never laughed, never joined any games or songs. One afternoon during free time, I was near the edge of the woods when I saw Mark standing just inside the trees watching us. He didn't move while I looked his way. It felt like he was waiting for something or someone. I tried to tell one of the other counselors about it later, but they just brushed me off. Said he was probably just checking on the area or something. The camp director, Mr. Jacobs, seemed nervous around Mark, but never said anything to the rest of us. Sometimes I'd see them talking quietly behind closed doors. I always wondered what they were discussing. 2 weeks after Mark showed up, he disappeared. Just gone. No note, no announcement, nothing. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't. When we asked Mr. Jacobs, he said Mark had to leave for personal reasons. That was it. I thought that was the end of it. Years later, I met up with some old campers online just reminiscing. Someone mentioned Mark and said they heard something strange from a former camp staff member. Apparently, Mark wasn't actually a counselor. No one knew where he came from or how he got in. He showed up one day, started acting like staff, and no one questioned it for 2 whole weeks. The camp director never put him on the official roster. They said they only realized after he disappeared. The creepy part, no one knows what he was really doing there. Looking back, I remember the way he watched us, the way he never really joined anything, and how the weird stuff happened while he was around. I don't think Mark was there to help. I think he was there for something else. I don't know what, but I don't think I ever want to find out. I was a counselor at this summer camp in northern Michigan back when I was about 19, Camp Cedar Pines. It was the kind of place with old wooden cabins, a big lake, and enough forest to get lost in if you weren't careful. The camp itself was pretty chill. Mostly little stuff like arts and crafts, hiking, swimming, and campfire songs. Nothing fancy, but there was one thing that never sat right with me. During the whole summer I worked there. The camp nurse, her name was Miss Reynolds. She was in her mid-50s, wore those thick glasses and always a big itchy sweater, no matter the weather. She ran the infirmary, which was basically a tiny room in one of the older buildings, with a cot and some basic medical supplies. Nothing really serious ever happened, but every few days, a kid would get a scrape or a fever or something and end up there. Now, what made her weird wasn't just that she always insisted on walking the kids back to their cabins alone after dark. That was the first red flag. No other staff did that. Usually a counselor would walk with the kid and stay nearby until they were settled. Miss Reynolds, nope. She always said she preferred it that way. Said it was best for privacy or something, but I noticed it always seemed to be at night after lights out. At first I didn't think much of it. The infirmary was next to the girls' cabins, so maybe she thought it was safer, but the whole thing felt off. It was always quiet, too quiet during those walks. You'd hear the occasional owl or a far-off coyote, but no footsteps besides hers and the kids, and sometimes even that felt too soft, like she was trying not to make a sound. One night, about 2 weeks into camp, one of the younger kids, Jake, he was maybe 10, came to me during lights out, looking half asleep and rubbing his arm. He said he woke up in his bunk with a bandage wrapped around it, but couldn't remember how he got hurt. The weird part was nobody else had seen him go to the infirmary. No counselor, no nurse, no one, but his arm was definitely scraped and the bandage looked fresh. I thought maybe he sleepwalked or something. Kids do weird things when they're tired, right? I asked him if he remembered the nurse walking him back, but he just shook his head. I swiped like he was scared to remember. I told the camp director, but he brushed it off as maybe Jake dreaming or confused. That kind of bugged me. The next few days, more little things started adding up. One evening I was hanging out near the infirmary while waiting for a group to finish an art project. I saw Miss Reynolds leave the building with a kid, but instead of walking straight to the cabins, she took a detour down this little trail that wasn't part of any usual path. It was darker there, thicker trees and no lights. I thought maybe she was just trying to take a shortcut. I called out, but she didn't turn around. The kid was silent the whole time, just following behind her like a little shadow. I waited for a bit, then lost sight of them as the trail curved out of view. A bad feeling settled in my chest. The next day, one of the other counselors mentioned that Miss Reynolds always kept the infirmary locked, the day when no one was around, which was strange since she was supposed to be there all day. She said it looked like no one had been in there for hours at a time. I started paying more attention to the nurse's schedule. She arrived early in the morning and stayed late at night. Sometimes the last one out of camp, but I never saw her hanging out or talking with any of the other staff. She was always alone, quiet, kind of withdrawn. One night, a few counselors and I were sitting by the campfire just chilling after lights out. We heard footsteps crunching in the bushes nearby, soft but steady. Someone joked it was a raccoon, but the noise kept going, moving closer. We all stopped talking and listened. Then the footsteps just stopped right outside the firelight. No rustling, no breathing sounds, nothing else. Just silence. After a few seconds, we all agreed to call it a night. I tried to shake off the feeling, but couldn't. The next day, a kid told me she had been woken up by someone touching her hair. She said she was sure it was the nurse, because of the smell of the hospital-type lotion Miss Reynolds always had, but she hadn't left the cabin that night. No one had. That was the moment I started really worrying. I asked around, but no one else had noticed anything unusual. Or if they did, they kept quiet. The camp director was dismissive, saying Miss Reynolds had years of experience and no complaints. But I had this sinking feeling that something was wrong. One night, I volunteered to check on the infirmary after lights out. The moon was just a thin sliver, and everything felt heavy and still. I walked over quietly, expecting the nurse to still be there, or at least to see her coming back from the cabins. But the infirmary was empty and locked tight. The windows were dark. I stood there for a moment, listening. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the woods behind the infirmary. I couldn't see anything, but the footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably an animal or another counselor taking a late walk. Still, I stayed near the building, trying to hear more. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Suddenly, I noticed a small scrap of fabric stuck on the bushes nearby. It looked like part of a kid's sweatshirt. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The next day, a kid came up with a bruise on her arm. She said she'd fallen while running, but the timing felt off. I went to the camp director and asked about the nurse again, mentioning strange walks in the fabric. He avoided eye contact and said he'd look into it. That night I stayed up near the infirmary waiting. Around midnight I saw a figure moving near the edge of the woods. It was Miss Reynolds. She was holding something in her hand, something small and pale. She walked slowly toward the cabins, then stopped and looked back toward the infirmary like she was making sure no one was watching. I wanted to call out, but froze. Instead, I followed her at a distance. She reached one of the cabins, slipped inside without knocking. My stomach twisted. I waited for a few minutes, and then heard a soft crying from inside the cabin. I finally found my voice and knocked hard on the door. No answer. I knocked again. Louder. Eventually, the door creaked open just enough to show Miss Reynolds' cold eyes. I told her she needed to come back with me, that I was taking the kid to the infirmary properly. She just shook her head and stepped aside, letting me in. The cabin was empty, except for a small child curled up in the corner, clutching her arm. I sat down next to the kid and asked what happened. She whispered that Miss Reynolds had been coming every night, touching her arm and telling her to be quiet. I called the director again, and insisted we get the kid checked out by a doctor. That was the last night Miss Reynolds worked at camp. They never really said what happened after that. The camp got a new nurse the following summer, and things went back to normal. But sometimes when it got dark, I thought about those quiet walks, unexplained injuries, and the silence that followed. I never saw Miss Reynolds again. It was the summer after junior year, and me and my friends had signed up to be campers at this small camp out in the middle of nowhere. Nothing fancy. Just cabins and woods and a lake, the kind of place where your phone barely gets surface, and your biggest worry is getting poison ivy. We were young, dumb, and bored enough to do whatever made the day more interesting. That's how we ended up sneaking out after lights out one night to explore the woods. The camp had strict rules. No one was supposed to be outside after lights out except staff, and the woods were off limits. But that night, me, Jesse, and Mark figured no one would care if we just poked around a bit. We grabbed flashlights and slipped out of our cabin, careful not to make noise. The air was thick and damp, the smell of pine and wet leaves everywhere. It felt kind of like being inside a giant breathing thing. Quiet except for the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. We weren't far in before we saw something that made us stop dead. Off the trail, barely lit by the moon, there was a man digging into the dirt. He was hunched over, working quickly but methodically, tossing dirt aside with his bare hands. Beside him was a big dark green duffel bag, the kind you use for camping gear. But it looked heavy, like it was stuffed with something solid. We froze. None of us said a word, but I think we all thought the same thing. What the hell is this guy burying out here? Huddled behind a tree and watched as he finished covering the hole, patting down the dirt, then turned and looked straight toward us. We hadn't thought he'd notice, but his eyes were sharp, almost cold, and he gave a small nod. Then he walked off, disappearing between the trees. We didn't move for a while. The whole thing felt wrong, like we'd stumbled on something we weren't supposed to see. But we were also too scared to run, like moving might make him come back for us. Finally, we scrambled back to the cabin and locked the door. I remember Jessie's hands shaking as she said, "We have to tell someone." I agreed, but none of us wanted to go to just any counselor. Some of them felt sketchy, like they only cared about keeping order and not what actually went on. The next morning, we told one of the counselors, a woman named Miss Harper, who was in charge of the older kids. She listened quietly, then smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like one you give when you know a secret. "Oh, you met Dave," she said like it was the most normal thing in the world. We looked at each other like she was joking. "Who?" Mark asked. "Dave," she repeated. He's kind of unofficial staff. Shows up when he wants. Helps out around camp, but no one really knows where he's from. We were confused, but figured maybe he was just some handyman, or someone who lived nearby. That didn't explain why he was burying a duffel bag in the woods in the middle of the night. Though we asked around later, trying to find out more about this day, but no one else seemed to know him. The camp director didn't mention him in the staff list, and no one else said they'd seen him. That night we kept an eye out. We heard quiet footsteps outside the cabin, distant voices, and sometimes the faint sound of digging again. But whenever we looked out, there was nothing. Over the next few days, things started feeling off. Stuff went missing. Flashlights, snacks, even some personal stuff from cabins. We told the counselors, but they shrugged it off as kids just being careless. But the weirdest part was the feeling that someone was watching us. One afternoon, I was walking back from the lake alone when I saw Dave again. He was sitting on a log just staring into the trees, not moving. His clothes were dirty, his face shadowed, and something about him was unsettling. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, smiled that same cold smile and said, "Quiet camp, huh?" I nodded and hurried back, heart pounding. We tried telling the staff again, but Miss Harper always cut us off, saying Dave helped with maintenance, and if we needed anything fixed, he was the guy to talk to. No one else admitted to knowing him. One night after lights out, the three of us snuck out again. We wanted to catch Dave doing whatever he was up to. We followed the faint sound of digging and saw him at the same spot in the woods. This time, we watched longer. Dave pulled something out of the duffel bag. It was a bunch of old photos and letters. He sat on the ground and stared at them, whispering to himself. The way he looked, lost and broken, made something in me tighten. Suddenly, he stood up, and for a moment, our eyes met. I felt frozen, like he could see right through us. Then he whispered, "You shouldn't be here," and started walking toward us. We bolted, stumbling through the trees, the sounds of him chasing us echoing behind. We didn't stop running until we were back at the cabins, heart racing and lungs burning. The next day, Miss Harper told us Dave had left. She said he was a troubled guy who had been coming to the camp for years, staying on and off, and no one had ever been able to get him to leave for good. I never went back to that camp, and even now, I wonder what was in that duffel bag and why Dave felt like he belonged there. Burying his past in the woods. I was about 14 when this happened. I went to this summer camp out in the middle of the woods, the kind of place where your phone barely worked, and cell service was a distant dream. The camp was supposed to be a safe place with counselors and staff around to watch over everyone. But one night, something happened that made the whole place feel wrong. It started on the third day of camp. We were all just settling in, learning the ropes, and the counselors kept reminding us to stay in groups, especially after dark. That night, after dinner, we were hanging out around the fire pit, telling stupid stories, when one of the younger kids, Sam, suddenly pointed out into the trees and said, "Hey, look, there's a guy watching us." At first, we thought he was messing around. Sam wasn't exactly the most reliable kid, always exaggerating stuff to get attention. But when we all looked, we saw a figure standing way off in the woods, not moving. He had binoculars up to his face, scanning the camp like he was studying us. It was unsettling. The thing was, the guy didn't look like staff. No uniform, no flashlight, nothing. Just a man standing completely still, like he was waiting for something. We told one of the counselors, a woman named Jenny, looked toward where Sam had pointed, but said she didn't see anyone. A few other counselors came over and checked, shining their flashlights into the dark woods, but no one was there. Jenny tried to brush it off, saying it was probably a park ranger checking the area. The camp was inside a state forest, so rangers did come through sometimes, but the whole thing didn't sit right with me or the others. That night, I kept waking up. I could hear noises outside the cabins, not animals but footsteps, like someone pacing just beyond the trees. The camp was supposed to be quiet after lights out, and the staff kept an eye out for trouble, so it felt weird hearing those sounds so close. A few times I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. My heart would jump, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The next day, some kids mentioned their stuff went missing. Nothing huge. A water bottle here, a flashlight there, but stuff that was just gone. When we told the counselors, they said to keep an eye on each other's things, but they didn't seem too concerned. Later I overheard Jenny talking on the phone, her voice low and tense. She said something about the guy again, and need to keep the kids calm. I couldn't hear much else, but it made my stomach turn. That afternoon during free time, a couple of us went down to the lake. As we walked through the trees, I felt like someone was watching us. The air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I stopped and scanned the tree. Saw nothing. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. A small path, leading deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. It looked old and overgrown, like no one had used it in years. Curious, I told the others, and we followed it for a bit. The path twisted and turned, and the further we went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no bugs, just the crunch of our footsteps on dead leaves. At one point we saw a man standing off to the side, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just staring in our direction. The way he stood was stiff, like he was trying not to be noticed. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and his face was shadowed by a baseball cap. We froze, and after a few seconds he turned and walked slowly away, disappearing between the trees. We ran back to camp, hearts pounding, and told the counselors what we saw. Jenny sighed and said that must be the ranger again. Probably checking the area for hikers or something, but something about how she said it felt off, like she didn't want to admit she knew the guy was there for different reasons. That night the footsteps outside the cabins came back louder, this time closer. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting every sound. Then around midnight, I heard soft knocking on my cabin door. I called out, but no one answered. The knocking stopped, then started again, faster, more urgent. I scrambled to the window and peeked outside. There was no one there. The porch light flickered for a moment, then went out. I cracked my flashlight and went to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, and the camp was dead silent. I told the other kids, but no one else heard the knocking. The next morning we got news that some hikers reported a man lurking near the park entrance, acting weird and watching people. The rangers were looking for him. Jenny gathered us all and told us to stay close, not to wander alone, and to report anything strange. For the rest of camp I kept feeling eyes on me. While I walked through the woods, I catch glimpses of movement, flash of dark clothes behind a tree, a shadow slipping between trunks. One afternoon, I found a small worn notebook tucked under a rock near the lake. Inside were pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the camp layout, with names and times written next to buildings and trails. I showed it to Jenny, but she just took it and said, "Thanks for the heads up," and didn't say anything else. The final night was the worst. After lights out, I heard voices whispering outside my cabin, glow, urgent, and angry. I peeked outside and saw two men arguing near the campfire circle. One was the man we'd seen in the woods. The other was someone I didn't recognize, wearing a racer's uniform. They argued quietly, but the tension was thick, The man with the cap suddenly pulled something out, a knife, small but sharp. The ranger grabbed his arm, struggling, and I ducked back inside, heart hammering. I called the counselors and told them what I saw. They came running and the men scattered into the woods. The next day, the camp was swarmed by actual rangers and police. They caught the man. He'd been hiding in the forest, watching the camp for days, waiting for the right moment. Turns out he wasn't a ranger at all, just someone who slipped into the area and refused to leave. After that, camp was shut down early. I left with a strange weight in my chest, like the woods had swallowed part of me. I never went back, and I never forgot how close we came to something that didn't feel safe at all. I was 13 when this happened. It was my first summer at this camp, the kind where your parents drop you off and you don't see them for 2 weeks. The camp was way out in the woods, a bit rough around the edges, but mostly just old cabins and dirt paths and those giant pine trees that go on forever. Everyone was mostly nice except for the usual stupid dares and pranks that happen when a bunch of kids are stuck together for weeks. The janitor was this quiet guy named Carl. He was probably in his 40s, skinny, always wore the same faded green jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No one really knew much about him except that he showed up early in the morning and stayed late at night. He never really talked to the kids, just kept to himself, mopping floors or fixing stuff. The counselors never said much about him either. He just kind of blended into the background. One night after dinner, the older kids were hanging out near the fire pit, telling stories and daring each other to do dumb stuff. Someone dared Mike, this kid, a year older than me, to follow Carl when he left the dining hall. It was supposed to be a joke. Mike said he'd catch Carl sneaking off to do something weird, like stealing food or hiding from the staff. Mike accepted the dare. He waited until Carl finished his shift in the dining hall and slipped out the back door. Mike followed, keeping a good distance so Carl wouldn't notice him. At first, Carl just walked down one of the dirt roads leading deeper into the camp, trees thickening on either side. Mike texted me later that night, saying he saw Carl stop near one of the cabins on the edge of the camp. The cabin was locked up tight, but Carl pulled out a key and let himself inside. Mike said he waited around for a few minutes, then went back to the cabins without saying anything else. The next morning, Mike was different. When we met up at breakfast, he barely ate. He sat alone at the end of the table, head down, staring at his hands. Someone asked him what happened last night, but he just shook his head and didn't answer. Later, when we were all supposed to get ready for activities, Mike just sat on the porch of our cabin, rocking back and forth, crying quietly. No one knew what to do. One of the counselors finally came over and asked Mike if he wanted to talk or call home, and Mike just begged her to let him leave. He didn't say why, just kept repeating, "Please, I want to go home." The counselors told us to give him space and said he was probably just overwhelmed. But I noticed how Carl didn't come around that morning and no one said anything about it. That day I kept thinking about what Mike might have seen. I tried to ask him again, but every time I got close he'd look away, panic written all over his face. The next night I heard strange noises near our cabin. It was quiet except for these soft scraping sounds, like someone dragging something across the ground. I peeked out my window, but couldn't see much in the dark, just the shadows of trees moving slightly in the breeze. I thought it might be an animal, but it didn't sound right. It was too deliberate, like someone was pacing or searching. The night after that, during lights out, I heard soft footsteps on the dirt path, just outside our cabin. The steps stopped right under the window, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I lay awake, heart pounding, wondering if it was Carl or someone else. The next day, Mike left. His parents came early and took him home. No one told us why, except that he wasn't feeling well, I didn't ask because I was scared of what I might find out. That afternoon, I saw Carl near the maintenance shed. He was holding a large, heavy-looking bag. When he saw me, he quickly dropped it behind the shed and walked away, looking around like he thought someone was watching him. Curious, I waited until Carl left and then crept behind the shed. The bag was old and dirty. When I unzipped it, I saw bandages, bottles of medicine, and a few syringes. I didn't know what to make of it, but it didn't feel right. Why was Carl hiding medical supplies? That night, I told one of the counselors what I saw. She looked uncomfortable and said, "Thanks for telling me," but then told me not to worry and to get some sleep. I couldn't sleep. Later that night, I heard someone whispering outside. I got up to check and saw a shadow moving by the cabins. When I shouted, the shadow froze for a second and then disappeared. I told the counselors again, but they just said it was probably one of the kids messing around, but I wasn't so sure. The final night, the camp had a big bonfire party. Everyone was there trying to have fun and forget the weird stuff from the week. As I walked back to my cabin, I saw Carl standing just beyond the tree watching us. His face was hard to see in the dark, but his eyes looked cold, empty. I froze and he didn't move or say anything. Then I quickly walked the other way, heart racing. The next morning, Carl was gone. The camp director said he quit suddenly and left without saying why. The counselors never explained what was really going on. I left camp that day with this knowing feeling that something had been very wrong and that Mike had been right to be scared. I never saw or heard about Carl again, but sometimes I wonder what he was doing in those woods and what might have happened if Mike had kept following him that night. The storm started right after dinner, when the sky just went from kind of cloudy to full-on dark, like someone flipped a switch. We were all hanging out in the main lodge waiting for the night's activity. The camp was this old place deep in the woods, with cabins spread out along dirt paths, and a big lodge that smelled like wood smoke and pine needles. Pretty normal camp stuff, except that night got weird. Anyway, the power went out, just poof. Everything went dark, like someone unplugged the whole place. The backup generator ticked in for the fridge and the kitchen, but the cabins were pitch black. We didn't have cell service, so no way to call anyone. The counselors told us to stay inside and keep calm, that the storm was strong, but would pass soon. I was in my cabin with 3 other girls. We had just finished brushing our teeth and were getting ready for bed when we heard the first knock. Quiet, soft, deliberate. At first I thought it was one of the counselors checking on us, but when I looked out the window, I didn't see anyone. Then it happened again, louder. This time, a knock on the door. "Aaron," a voice called out. It was a woman's voice, calm but firm. None of us knew anyone named Aaron at camp. We all looked at each other, confused. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just the sound of rain hitting the roof harder. The knocking came again, this time on the cabin next door. We could hear it faintly through the walls, a soft tapping, then a voice asking for Aaron. We peeked out from behind the curtain. No one was there. The rain was coming down so hard that the ground looked shiny, like glass. After a few minutes, the knocks started moving cabin to cabin. We could hear them faintly from the other side of the camp too, like some quiet rhythm traveling down the dirt paths. Every cabin door got the same question. "Is Aaron here?" One of the girls whispered, "There's no Aaron at camp. Who would be asking for her?" I didn't have an answer. The counselors tried to keep us calm, telling us it was probably some prank or a mistake, but their faces didn't look calm. They seemed tense, like they were watching the woods more than us. After about an hour of this, the knocking stopped. We thought it was over. Then we heard a voice call from the woods. "Aaron, please, it's me." The voice was soft but desperate. It came from right outside the tree, maybe 100 yards away. No one moved. I heard the counselors whispering to each other, telling the kids to stay inside and lock the doors. The rain slowed down, but the wind picked up, making the branches scrape against each other in a way that sounded almost like whispering. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that voice. The knocking, the way the night felt heavier than any storm I'd ever been in. Around 3:00, there was a faint flash of light through the trees like a flashlight. I told one of the counselors, and she told me to stay in my cabin and lock the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out the back door of the cabin, just enough to see the path in the dark. I saw a figure standing near the edge of the woods, holding a flashlight pointed at the ground. The person was a woman, tall and thin, wearing a silk jacket and jeans. She looked right at me, but didn't say anything. I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. The next morning, the camp director gathered us all in the lodge. He said that after the storm passed, they searched the entire camp in the nearby woods, but found no sign of anyone looking for an Aaron. He said they called the local rangers, but there was no missing person report for anyone named Aaron in the area. One counselor whispered to me that the woman was probably just lost, maybe confused by the storm. But when I asked around, no one remembered seeing her before or after the night. A few days later, the camp ended early because of some damage to the power lines, and we were all sent home. I never saw or heard about the woman again, and no one ever explained why someone was knocking on every cabin door, asking for a girl named Erin. There was no Erin at camp or anywhere nearby. I was at this summer camp for a week when I was about 15. I'd been there before a couple of years earlier and signed up again, mostly because all my friends were going and it was easier than trying to find a summer job. Nothing fancy, just a regular camp deep in the woods with cabins, a mess hall, campfire circle, the usual stuff. You know how it goes. When I got there, they handed me my cabin assignment, cabin 7. At first I figured that was no big deal. I had stayed in a few different cabins before, and as long as it had a roof and a bed, it was fine. But then I saw one of the returning campers, Mia. She was maybe a year older than me, and had been at camp for years, and she looked off, like really tense. I overheard her talking to one of the counselors saying she couldn't stay in cabin 7 this time. She didn't say why, just kept shaking her head and looking around like she was trying to keep herself calm. That stuck with me. Why would someone be so freaked out about a cabin? It's not like a haunted house or anything. I thought maybe she had a bad memory from the place or something, but no one pressed her. The counselors just said they figured something else out for her and walked away like they didn't want to talk about it. The next day during free time, I caught Mia sitting on the edge of the field staring into the trees, looking completely frozen. I asked her if she was okay, and she just shook her head and said, "You wouldn't want to be in that cabin either." She got up and walked away before I could say anything else. I figured maybe she was messing with me, or it was some inside joke I didn't get. But later that night, while I was getting ready for bed in cabin 7, I felt something weird, like the whole cabin was watching me. It sounds dumb, but it was just this feeling that the walls were closing in or something. The windows were small and the trees outside looked like they were leaning in. The wind was barely blowing, but I could hear creaks and rustles all night. The next morning I noticed that one of the other campers, Kevin, had a weird scratch on his arm. He said he didn't remember how he got it, just woke up with it. No one else seemed to notice or care. I asked around, but no one knew anything. It was just shrugged off as a bug bite or something. The camp counselor on duty that day was a woman named Sarah. She was nice but kind of quiet, always moving between cabins, checking on everyone. I saw her talking to Mia in hushed tones outside the mess hall, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. That afternoon, Mia disappeared, like no one knew where she went. They searched the cabins, the woods nearby, even the lake, but no sign. The counselors tried to keep everyone calm, saying she'd probably just wandered off and would be found soon, but something didn't feel right. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up again, and the cabin felt colder than before. I swear, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, but when I looked, there was no one there. The flashlight beams from the counselor's rounds didn't catch anything unusual either. The next morning, Mia showed up at breakfast, but she wasn't herself. She didn't talk or look at anyone. She just sat there, eyes wide and blank, like she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. After a while, she begged to leave, said she couldn't stay in cabin 7 or anywhere near it. The counselors arranged for her to go home early. After Mia left, things didn't get better. Strange sounds in the woods, twigs snapping, but no one there. A few kids reported hearing voices calling their names, but no one found anyone around. The counselor, Sarah, started walking the paths alone at night, which seemed weird to me. She never talked about it. One night, a couple of us snuck out of the cabin after lights out just to explore. We thought we were being brave, but we ended up hearing heavy breathing behind us in the dark. We ran back to the cabins, but the breathing kept pace for a while before fading away. The last night of camp, I decided I had to figure out what was going on with cabin 7. I stayed up listening, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft tapping at the window, like someone trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I didn't move at first, just froze, heart pounding. Then I saw a shadow slip past the trees outside, too tall to be a kid. I called out, but there was no answer. The tapping stopped. The shadow disappeared. The next morning, the counselor announced early dismissal because of some safety concerns. I didn't ask questions. I just packed up and left as fast as I could. Years later, I found out Mia never talked about that camp again, and the counselors there wouldn't answer questions either. No one explained what was up with cabin 7 or what had happened during those nights. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. I never really thought much about the old camp photos, you know. Like every year, the camp would send out those cheesy group pictures, with everyone lined up smiling awkwardly in the sun or under the trees. I just looked at them like a kid with faces of friends, goofy poses, all that. But years later, while I was an adult and feeling kind of nostalgic, I decided to look them up online, just curious what the old place looked like now, and to maybe find a photo with me in it. That's when I noticed something. At first it was subtle. On the edges of the photos, behind the groups of campers and counselors, was this man. He was always there, not front and center, just standing off to the side or partially hidden behind a tree. I thought maybe he was a camp staff member or a volunteer who hung around, but wasn't involved much. But there was something about the way he stood too still, always looking straight at the camera with a blank expression, and no one ever seemed to acknowledge him. So, I started looking at photos from every year I could find online. I'd been at that camp for 2 summers, so I checked the years before I even arrived and the ones after I left. That guy was in every single photo. Same spot, same blank face. I even checked the camp's website to see if he was listed as staff. Nothing. No name, no mention of him anywhere. That was the start of it. It didn't feel like a creepy thing right away, just weird. I thought maybe he was some groundskeeper or a security person who always hung around but didn't interact with campers. But then I started remembering small things from my time there. Like how sometimes at night when the camp was supposed to be dead quiet, you'd hear footsteps out by the woods. Not the usual night sounds, These were heavy, deliberate, not from the direction of the staff cabins or the road, but just wandering along the edge of the camp like someone pacing. I remember once, near the end of my first summer there, I was sitting outside my cabin after lights out reading with a flashlight. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a dark shape standing beyond the tree, watching. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. I told a counselor the next day, but they brushed it off. Said it was probably one of the older kids messing around. There was also this weird moment during a campfire one night. Everyone was roasting marshmallows, telling stories, when one of the counselors suddenly stopped talking and stared hard into the woods behind us. The campfire flickered and threw shadows around, but no one else seemed to see anything. Then he told us to get back to cabin early that night and not to go near the tree. No explanation. The next day, a few kids mentioned seeing a man standing in the woods at odd times. No one knew who he was, or why he was there. Counselors again said it was probably a ranger or someone checking the area, and not to worry. At the time it was easy to ignore, but after seeing that man in every photo, I started piecing things together. There was no official record of him. No one seemed to want to talk about him, but he was definitely there, lurking the edges. On my second summer, I got braver and tried to find out more. One evening, after everyone was supposed to be asleep, I snuck out and followed the edge of the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was making those footsteps. I walked quietly, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loud. I thought I saw him once, a tall man in a dark jacket standing behind a cluster of pine trees. He didn't move, just watched. When I stepped closer, he disappeared like a shadow. I called out, but nothing. My friend said I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. Another thing that felt off was how sometimes the camp's usual noises would just stop. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves, just this heavy, suffocating silence, like the woods were holding their breath. Then one night, the fire alarm went off for no reason. Everyone had to evacuate to the mess hall in the dark. While we were waiting, I saw that same man standing outside the window looking in. The counselors didn't notice him at first, but when someone pointed him out, he vanished before they could get to the door. They said it was probably a prankster or someone from outside trying to scare us. The last night I was there, I stayed up late again. I was watching the woods from the porch of the cabin, thinking about all the times I'd seen that figure out there. Suddenly I heard breathing behind me, low, steady. I spun around. No one. I thought I was alone. Then I felt it, a presence, like someone standing just a little too close, but invisible in the dark. I grabbed my jacket and ran to the counselor cabin, pounding on the door. They looked at me like I was crazy, but the way I was shaking made them let me in. They checked around, but no one was there. Still, after that, the camp director decided to close the camp a week early. Years later, I searched again online, and the photos were still there, always with that man in the background. I never found out who he was or why he was there. No one I asked would talk about it. But every time I look at those pictures, I see him standing just outside the group watching. I never went back to that camp, and I don't think I ever will. I was a camp counselor for one summer, just a couple of months during my last year of college. It was one of those small, old-fashioned camps in the middle of nowhere. A lake, a bunch of cabins, a mess hall, and a dock with canoes. Pretty chill place overall. Most nights were just hanging out, telling dumb stories around the fire, and trying to stay awake long enough to hear the night frogs. My last night there was off. It was late August, the end of the season, and a little colder than usual. The kind of cold that sneaks up on you after the sun goes down, and the lake water cools everything off. I had stayed up alone after the campers went to bed, just sitting on the porch of the main lodge with a coffee, thinking about how I'd be back to city life the next day. The camp was quiet, really quiet. Usually you'd hear kids laughing somewhere or counselors talking. That night, everything was muted. Around midnight I decided to walk down to the lake. It was too dark to swim or anything, but the water always helped me think. The moon was thin and high, so there wasn't much light except a faint glow bouncing off the lake's surface. I walked down the path, my boots crunching softly on the gravel, and the only other sound was the water lapping gently at the shore. I got to the canoe dock. It's that old wooden one that sticks out a little into the lake with maybe a dozen canoes tied up, rocking quietly. I looked out across the water. The far side of the lake was just a dark line of trees. Nothing unusual, but for some reason I felt like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, temp paranoia, I guess, and leaned against the railing, staring at the dark water. That's when I saw it. Underneath the dock, just standing there, was a figure, completely still. The dock's wooden beams cast shadows, but I could tell it was a person tall wearing something dark, maybe a jacket or hoodie pulled tight. The weird thing was the figure wasn't moving at all, not even shifting weight or turning their head, just standing there like a statue. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Maybe it was a trick of the moonlight or a tear standing very still. But no, the shape was definitely human. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" Nothing. The figure stayed still. A knot started tightening in my stomach. I didn't know anyone was supposed to be out here. All the campers were in bed and counselors were mostly inside the lodge or cabins. I glanced back toward the camp. The path was empty, the windows dark, except for a few lights from the main building. I turned back to the dock, and the figure was gone. No movement, no splash, no sound. I stood there frozen for a second, heart pounding, eyes scanning the shadows under the dock. No sign of anyone. No footprints on the gravel where I've been walking. No sound of footsteps running off into the woods. It was like whoever it was just vanished. I felt a sudden cold rush down my spine. So I walked back to the lodge faster than I had come, trying to shake off the feeling. When I got inside, I told the camp director what I saw. She raised an eyebrow, said maybe I'd been seeing things, but that the shadows were messing with me. She told me to get some rest before the long drive back home. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing weird noises outside, rustling in the trees, distant snapping twigs. At one point I heard soft footsteps circling the lodge. I peeked outside, but no one was there. I checked every window, all locked. The next morning, I was packing up when one of the campers came running to me, pale and shaking. "Did you see someone outside last night?" she whispered. I told her about the figure under the dock. She said she'd been too scared to say anything, but she thought she saw a man walking near the cabins late at night a few times during the week. He never talked to anyone, just watched from the shadows. The camp director said there was no record of anyone being on the property besides the staff and campers, and that the woods were usually empty except for the occasional ranger checking the trails. After I left that morning, I never went back. I didn't tell anyone else. Mostly because no one believed me. But every time I think about that night, I wonder who that person was and how they disappeared without a trace. I worked as a counselor one summer at this little camp out in the woods. Nothing fancy, just cabins, a lake, dining hall, and those old walkie-talkies they hand out to staff for emergencies. Most days were pretty normal. Kids running around, campfires, bad songs, that kind of thing. But the nights, well, that's when things started to get weird. We had cabins lined up in a row, and I was assigned to cabin 7 with 6 kids, all about 12 or 13. The walkie-talkies were supposed to keep us in touch with the main office, or the other counselors, especially after lights out in case of emergencies. Usually it was just static, or nothing at all after midnight. But one night around 11:30 I was lying in my bunk scrolling through my phone. No Wi-Fi obviously, but I was trying to pass the time when I heard it. A whisper on the walkie-talkie. Just a faint crackle at first, like someone breathing close to the mic. Then I caught a name, soft, barely audible. It sounded like Emily. I froze. Emily was one of the girls in my cabin, asleep maybe 10 feet away. I lifted the walkie up, thinking maybe some kid was messing with it, but the channel was supposed to be quiet at night. I whispered back, "Emily, is that you?" No answer, just static. I shrugged it off, told myself it was probably just radio interference. That happens, right? The forest, the hills, maybe another radio signal mixing in. But then it happened again the next night around the same time. The walkie crackled and I heard another name, Marcus, another kid from my cabin. I sat up, heart starting to race a bit. I whispered into the mic, "Marcus." Again, no reply, just static. I asked the other counselors if they heard anything on their walks at night. None of them had. They laughed when I told them about the names. Said maybe it was my imagination or interference from a nearby ham radio or something. That made me feel a little crazy, but I kept listening. Over the next few nights, I heard more names. Sophie, Jake, Lily, all kids from my cabin, and always just one name at a time whispered. So quiet it was almost impossible to tell if it was a real voice or just noise. But the names were right. I tried to tell the camp director. She gave me the "you're tired" look and said maybe I was imagining things, or the walkie was malfunctioning. She said they ran checks and everything was fine. One night the whispers didn't stop. They kept coming one after another like a slow countdown. First Emily, then Marcus, then Sophie, and so on. I was wide awake now, gripping a walkie, staring into the dark cabin where the kids slept. I checked on them. All of them were there, breathing, asleep, nothing wrong. But then the walkie started whispering a name I didn't recognize. It wasn't a kid in my cabin. It sounded older, more like a man's name. David. I paused, suddenly feeling really cold, like the air had dropped 10 bice. I called out softly into the walkie, "Who's David?" No answer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, ready to check the grounds. That's when I noticed the other counselors' walks were dead silent. No crackles, no voices. I told myself to calm down. I walked outside around the cabin, flashlight sweeping over the trees. Nothing, just the usual night sounds of crickets, leaves rustling. But then, about 20 feet from the cabin, I heard footsteps crunch on the dirt. Slow, deliberate. I froze and shone the light toward the sound. No one there. I walked closer to the wood's edge, trying to hear better. The footsteps stopped. Silence again. Back at the cabin, I checked the kids, still asleep. I stayed up the rest of the night clutching that walkie, waiting for whatever was next. The last night I was there, I heard the whispers again. But this time, they were different. They weren't just names anymore. They were full sentences, faint and broken. "Help me. Don't let him. Stay quiet." I pressed the talk button to respond, but didn't say anything. I was scared to make any noise, scared of whatever was out there. When morning came, I packed my stuff, told the director I was leaving early. She asked why, but I just said I wasn't feeling well. I still have that walkie-talkie somewhere, but I never turned it on again after that summer. I don't know who or what was whispering those names, but I'm sure it was someone watching, waiting, and using that static to get closer without being seen. I never really thought about it much until years later, scrolling through some old camp photos online. I grew up going to this summer camp every year from like age 9 through 14, and the place was huge. Woods, cabins, a lake, all that classic camp stuff. What always stuck with me was this one counselor, Mike, He was my favorite, easygoing, always joking around, never like the other counselors who sometimes seemed stuck up or serious. I remember him helping me learn how to row a canoe, and once he even stayed after lights out to fix my busted sleeping bag zipper. He just felt different in a good way, but when I looked through the camp's old group photos online, like the official ones they posted every summer and the rosters they uploaded from each year, Mike was nowhere to be found. No pictures, no staff lists, nothing. Showed some of the old friends I still talk to from camp and they said they didn't remember any Mike either. I even messaged the camp admin on their website asking about him, but they said no one by that name had worked there in years, or even visited. At first I figured it was just a mix-up, maybe Mike was a nickname or maybe I remembered the name wrong, but I was sure it was Mike. His face, the way he smiled, how he wore a faded green camp jacket with the patch on the sleeve. It was all so clear in my memory. Anyway, this story happened one summer when I was about 12. The one time I actually got to spend more than a day with Mike. The camp was buzzing that week because it was the last one before they started renovating some of the cabins. I was in cabin 9 with some kids my age, and Mike was our counselor. We had a few group activities during the day, and Mike was usually the one leading the hikes or the campfire songs. He was easy to talk to, never pushed anyone too hard, and always listened. One evening after dinner, Mike told us we could have some free time before lights out. Most kids went to the mess hall of the lake, but I decided to stay near the cabins and watch the sunset from the hill overlooking the camp. Mike followed me after a bit, sitting down quietly beside me on the grass. We talked about dumb stuff, music, summer plans, school, and for the first time, I felt like a kid who actually mattered. Then, about 20 minutes before dark, the wind started picking up. The sky got heavy and gray, and I could hear low thunder way off in the distance. Mike stood up and said, "We should probably head back to our cabin." On the way back, I noticed the woods sounded different. Usually there were crickets or frogs, but this time the sounds were muffled, like everything was holding its breath. The thunder was closer now, and the first drops of rain started to fall. When we got back, the cabin felt colder than usual, even though it wasn't late. Mike locked the door behind us, but I thought that was weird. Usually they left the cabins unlocked until lights out. That night, the storm came in fast. Heavy rain, lightning that lit up the windows, thunder so loud it shook the walls. The power went out about an hour after lights out, and the whole camp was plunged into darkness. The emergency generator ticked on for some areas, but our cabin was dead silent. Mike handed out flashlights and told us to stay calm. We all sat in the main room, huddled under blankets, listening to the storm. The wind was howling, branches hitting the roof. I remember feeling safe with Mike there. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft knocking on the cabin door. Then again, it was faint, but deliberate. Mike went over and peeked through the window. There was no one there, just the rain and dark, probably just a branch, he said. But he looked tense. Then we heard footsteps outside circling the cabin. Slow, heavy steps in the mud. Mike told us to stay quiet and not move. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the door just a crack. No one. I remember thinking he was brave, but the way he shut the door fast made me realize he was scared too. The footsteps kept going, fading into the woods. The next day, some counselors checked the perimeter, but found no signs of anyone. The camp director said it was probably just some pranksters or trunks from the nearby road, but it didn't feel like that to me. The rest of the week went by, but I noticed Mike seemed distracted, like he was watching the woods a lot. One afternoon, I asked if he was okay. He smiled but didn't say much. The night before I left, I woke up because I thought I heard whispering. I got out of bed and peeked outside the cabin window. Mike was standing outside in the rain, staring toward the trees. He didn't notice me. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but I didn't. Instead, I watched until he turned and walked back inside. Years later, after I started wondering about Mike's absence in the camp records, I called some of the older staff who had been there when I was a kid. No one knew him. Some said they remembered a counselor with a different name working the cabins back then. But no Mike. I looked through old camp newsletters, message boards, even tried tracking down former campers online. Still nothing. I thought maybe Mike was just some temper volunteer who wasn't officially on the books, but it didn't add up. How did someone spend a whole summer working with kids without any paper trail? The strangest part, I once asked a counselor who had been at the camp long before me about a green jacket with a patch. She said no one wore anything like that, at least not officially. It's like Mike was there and not there at the same time. I never told anyone else because it felt crazy, like maybe I was just mixing up memories or inventing someone I wanted to believe in. But every now and then when I think about those nights of the storm, the footsteps, Mike standing outside in the rain, I wonder if he was trying to protect us from something no one else saw. Whatever it was, I'm glad I never had to find out what it really meant. There was always this one rule at camp that nobody really questioned. Don't go near the maintenance shed behind the mess hall. It wasn't locked or anything, but all the counselors made it clear it was off limits. Some said it was because of dangerous tools or old chemicals. Others just warned it was creepy and no one should be near it after dark. We all just accepted it like how you accept some weird rule a parent gives you without asking why. I was about 15 and a counselor myself by then, which meant I was supposed to be the one enforcing rules. But honestly, I didn't think much about that shed until one night that changed everything. That summer had been uneventful. I'd been working the late shift, cleaning up after dinner with a few campers still milling around. The camp was tucked into a dense forest, so by 9 or 10 p.m. it got dark fast, and the only light came from the porch lamps near the mess hall. Most kids were already in their cabins by then, buzzing with tired energy or falling asleep. I was wiping down tables when I noticed something out the window. One of the other counselors, Rick, a guy who was usually pretty friendly and jokey, was walking with one of the younger campers, Tim, toward the maintenance shed. It felt strange because no one ever went near that place, especially not with campers. Rick's arm was around Tim's shoulder, like he was guiding him, but Tim didn't seem to be struggling or scared. They just walked slowly, almost like they were talking quietly. The shed was just a few steps from the mess hall, so I could hear the faint scrape of the shed door swinging open. Then I noticed Rick came back out alone. No Tim. My heart started pounding, but I told myself Tim probably just slipped away or was hiding somewhere as a prank. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside trying to call Tim's name. No answer. I looked around, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Nothing. I went back inside and told Rick casually, like maybe he'd seen Tim and sent him off somewhere. He just shrugged and said Tim had gone back to his cabin earlier, which didn't make sense because I'd just seen them walk toward the shed together. The next hour was filled with this weird tension. I checked the cabins. All the kids were there, Tim included, asleep like nothing had happened. I asked him next day if he remembered going near the shed with Rick. He just blinked and said no. I started paying closer attention after that. Over the next few days, I noticed little things about Rick that were off, like how sometimes he'd be gone for a few minutes and come back smelling faintly like gasoline or something metallic. Once I heard him talking on the phone in hushed tones, saying things that didn't make sense, something about getting it fixed and making sure no one finds out. Then there were the nights. I worked late almost every night, and sometimes I catch glimpses of Rick near the shed, moving things around or talking softly to himself. Other counselors joked that he was just cleaning or doing his maintenance duties, but none of us were supposed to go in there. And it never seemed like normal work, more like he was hiding something. One night I decided to follow him. He left the mess hall after lights out just before midnight. I stayed back, watching from the shadows near the cabins. He moved slow, tearful. When he got to the shed, he fumbled with the lock for a long time, finally opening the door and stepping inside. I waited, hard in my throat, shining my flashlight over the shed door cracks. After maybe 15 minutes, the door creaked open, and Rick stepped out alone again. No one else. But this time, I saw something in his hand, a small bundle wrapped in a tarp. He carried it like it weighed a lot. I wanted to call out, stop him, but I was frozen. What if it was nothing? What if I was imagining things? Rick slipped away into the woods behind the camp, and I didn't follow. I just stood there breathing hard, the night thick with silence, except for the crickets. The next day, I told the camp director what I'd seen, hoping for some kind of explanation. He got weirdly defensive and brushed it off, saying Rick was probably doing some late repairs, and I shouldn't worry. That didn't sit right with me. I started asking around quietly, trying to piece together Rick's background. No one really knew much. He'd been hired just that summer, and records about him were sparse. No past camps, no references anyone could verify. It felt like he appeared out of nowhere. Then the camp owner announced that Rick was leaving early, taking personal reasons. No one asked questions. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that shed. That night, when Tim disappeared and Rick came back alone, the weight of it settled in my stomach. Years later, I looked up the camp online and found old staff lists, and Rick's name was nowhere to be found. No official record at all. I checked with some former staff members I still talk to, and none of them ever heard of Rick. Sometimes late at night, I think about that shed and how something was hidden there. Something no one wanted anyone to find. And Tim, he never mentioned that night or that walk, like it never happened.